Welcome to China Dispatches, the official podcast of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. This is your host, Jacob Gunter, the Chamber's Senior Policy and Communications Manager. Today, I'll be speaking with Charlotte Ruhl, one of the board members of the European Chamber, and we'll be discussing our Business Confidence Survey, or BCS, a joint report produced by the European Chamber and our partners at Roland Berger. Thanks for coming on our podcast today, Charlotte. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, sure, Jacob. So my name is Charlotte Ruhl. I'm CEO of NG China, and I am a board member of the European Chamber of Commerce in China. We will speak today about the Business Confidence Survey, so BCS as we name it. And for listeners who don't know, our annual BCS survey is a member of the European Chamber. This year we had 585 respondents. We work with our partner, Roland Berger, to prepare the questionnaire, perform the survey, and then analyze the results. We have a wide range of industries represented, a good balance of MNCs and SMEs, and a strong majority of respondents have more than a decade of experience in China. We ask around 60 questions, and we have a wealth of data to pass as we piece together the big picture. A big picture that also takes into account local specificities, so we have additional dozen questions for each local chapter.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Charlotte. So let's jump right in and kind of get to the meat of the BCS. So I think we can all admit, looking back at 2020, that it was a hell of a year. And I recall a year ago when we were putting together the 2020 Business Confidence Survey, the outbreak was not yet a pandemic. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. And we ended up doing this joint survey kind of at the end of February 2020 with the German Chamber of Commerce. We found some really grim expectations of what was going to happen. How did companies actually fare out in the end?
Yes, indeed, you are right. So looking back at this survey you refer to, at this point in time, half of the respondents expected year-on-year revenue decrease. And what we observe now with the BCS is that instead, 24% saw revenue to go down. So actually that's far less. In the same survey, only 0.5% anticipated a revenue increase. Instead, 42% saw revenue climb. Revenue increases were higher in B2C sectors, such as retail, cosmetics, and automotive. Revenue decrease, there were quite some, and they were most significant in areas most impacted or most exposed actually to COVID restrictions, shutdowns, like aerospace and aviation, and food and beverage. Then one last point maybe about revenues. Revenue swings, both up and down, were sharper for SMEs and MNCs. And more specifically, SMEs report to the chamber that if they were well positioned or flexible, they were able to profit immensely. Meanwhile, SMEs exposed to the pandemic, such as those in education, hospitality, or construction, lacked the resources of larger companies to offset losses.
Yeah, so it seems like revenues fared much better than expected. Though, to be fair, we still, according to the records, had kind of a record low for growth development. But I think this was expected, and in many ways, companies outperformed those expectations. How are companies managing in terms of profitability? What does the data show as far as how they performed compared to their global operations?
Well, actually, that's quite interesting because 73%, so nearly 3/4 of respondents, had positive EBIT, which holds steady compared to the last 5 years, during which profitability has fluctuated between 71 and 75%. The resurgence of the China market compared to the rest of the world is also telling, and 51% of our respondents saw China EBIT margin as higher than their company's worldwide average. This is a very significant number. Actually, this is a year-on-year increase of 13 percentage points. And optimism on growth, quite naturally, increased significantly there again, from 48% to 68%.
Yeah, so the numbers obviously come out quite positively for our member companies, which again I think for those of us living in China and seeing that the country bounced back isn't too surprising. But one of the notable impacts I think that COVID really had was on the ability for foreign workers who were outside of China during Chinese New Year, and then that stayed out because at the time, the worst hit country was China, and then as the outbreak became a pandemic, they couldn't return to China because of the COVID restrictions. What kind of numbers did the data reveal in terms of how negative of an impact the lack of foreigners being able to return was having on companies?
Actually, that's a very important point that you mentioned, Jacob. And I think this is somehow putting the European business situation as relatively fragile. 73% of respondents noted a negative impact from the travel restriction between mainland China and other regions. And that's the most common negative impact of the pandemic for our members. And actually, it goes further because even for companies that manage to get their foreign employees back into China, 61% view the entry restrictions as a top 3 issue for retaining foreign talent. More and more are worried that talent will leave eventually if they have to spend another year without being able to return home to see their loved ones.
No, I certainly agree. The impact of these restrictions have been really negative, and I think we've all seen too many foreigners that have long been a part of the community simply give up on returning, and I think that'll have a really negative impact long term that goes kind of against China's interests, because a lot of these people are the real China experts. They speak the language, they know the culture. Perhaps some of them will come back after the pandemic is over, but some of them may decide not to, and that's a real loss for communities here. So let's move on to another one of the big conversations that we've seen spoken about globally in regards to China, which is what's happening in terms of diversification. About a year ago, a lot of companies were talking about how they had put too many eggs into the China basket. They were looking for ways to move some of that investment elsewhere, to build resilience in their supply chains, or adopting things like the China plus one approach of building extra production facilities outside of China to switch on if they need to. What does the BCS tell us? Are companies leaving? How are supply chains shifting? What kind of changes are underway?
Well, European companies are not leaving China, Jacob, and few are seeking to diversify supply chains to other markets. Giving a bit of figure on that, only 9% of respondents are looking to shift at least some of their current or planned investment in China to other markets. And this is the lowest share of respondents on record. Instead, we see an increase in the number of respondents that would like to expand operations, with 59% aiming to do so, and that's the highest since 2014. So in last year BCS, that was 51%, to give a reference. Going a bit further, 30% of our members, of our respondents, are in a JV with a local partner. And of those, 27% increased their position in JVs in 2020, with 18% taking a controlling share and 2% completely buying out their partner. And 26% are further or fully onshoring their supply chain into the market. So you see, the figures are quite big. And actually, if I take the flip side, 4% are divesting some of their operation outside of China, which is a very low figure, and 1% leaving completely.
Wow, so it seems like decoupling isn't quite happening the way, especially perhaps the Trump administration had intended to drive foreign companies out of China.
Yeah, but actually, this is indeed not happening exactly the way we thought, Jacob. When we saw decoupling happening, we thought that company would actually decouple out of China. But what we observe with the onshoring movement is that they are decoupling their China operation from their global operation. So it's slightly different.
So it's quite clear that there's this effort to deepen their positions of European companies here in China, to try to onshore their supply chains. What do you think it is that's driving these decisions?
Well, actually, I think that's very practical. Producers are considerably exposed to critical inputs. And by critical inputs, I mean components or equipment that are imported and which would be difficult or impossible to replace. Just to give you an order of magnitude, only 21% of respondents reported that they have no such component or equipment. So a massive amount of respondents are exposed to that. and 34% of them noted that there simply are no viable alternatives. So they are to stay in China and they have to stay in China. The rest can find some sort of alternative, but they know that it would come at higher cost, lower quality, or with compatibility issue. So this is one of the key driving factors for onshoring.
We had similar questions in the decoupling report that the Chamber published in January. And I was surprised to see that a lot of those numbers ended up being quite similar, because this time we had a larger respondent pool. And I think we kind of expected that to go down a bit and to show a little less exposure. But yeah, unfortunately, only 21% of companies reporting not having some sort of exposure. That's quite stark when we're just looking at manufacturers. And you know, the main driving force behind these concerns, I think, of course, is the politicization of business and its geopolitics. And we had a few questions about the politicization of business that was more so looking into China itself, looking at politicization within the country, not necessarily as much cross-border or in other markets. But let's look into these. We see that things are really heating up these days. There are concerns in regards to Xinjiang and Hong Kong about human rights. Those are being voiced by many countries abroad. There's plummeting public opinions on China, in particular from liberal democracies, as found in the most recent Pew data. So it kind of feels like a lot of companies are really operating in a bit of a minefield. So what story do we get from the data?
So in the Business Confidence Survey, Jacob, we have 41% of respondents that found that business in China became more political in the last year. But what is important to note is that this survey was taken before the EU-China sanctions and attack of European retailers over forced labor concerns in Xinjiang. So it is likely that if this survey was retaken today, these numbers would be higher. And there were many sources of politicization, but the top three were the Chinese government at 50%, the Chinese media at 39%, and international media at 28%.
Yeah, and I think the politicization of business may have been kind of further worsened with the sort of the placing into the freezer, as it were, of the CAI just a few days ago. So this kind of covered a lot of the sort of the more interesting findings that we had. But of course, kind of at the core of the Business Confidence Survey, there are these long-standing issues faced by European companies. So as the pandemic was taking up most officials' time, I think we can forgive them for the reform agenda kind of slowing down a little bit and not seeing the kind of regulatory reform that we might otherwise have hoped for. But let's kind of quickly look through some of these big picture items and have a look at what changed year over year and what didn't, what got better, what got worse. So first, let's look at some of the bigger picture market issues. So market access and a level playing field. Charlotte, what do we see in the BCS?
Well, Jacob, in terms of market access, actually, you are right in the sense that those are long-standing issues and it's not changing that much, meaning that market access restrictions exist for 45% of respondents. And what is important to note is that these are increasingly the result of indirect barriers, like administrative approvals or licensing, which impact nearly 3 times as many members as direct barriers like the negative list. So I think it is very important for us to remain cautious and to advocate for a better business environment, because we see some improvement on the paper, if I can say it this way, but indirect barriers are still there and actually increasing. And now coming to the level playing field. 46% report an unlevel playing field. So that's actually a figure that joins 2 elements. 39% report an unequal treatment that is detrimental to foreign invested companies, and 8% unequal treatment detrimental to domestic companies. So there is a little bit of progress compared to the year before. We were at 50%. It seems that things are going in the right direction, but we really need this to move even further. 46% is still a high number, and it's as important to end favorable treatment for locals as it is for ending favorable treatment for foreign companies. Discretionary enforcement occurs in many ways, and most commonly reported through market access, public procurement, and communication with the government. 45% of respondents don't see a level playing field in the coming 5 years, if ever.
All right, well, let's talk about, instead of kind of market opening and level playing field, let's move on to some of the reform agenda, specifically looking at SOE reform, and also some of the more regulatory reforms that we expect. So again, what do we see, Charlotte?
Well, Jacob, China's SOE reform continues to go in the wrong direction, towards better, stronger, bigger state firms. 48% of respondents yet again expect that the state-owned economy will benefit at the expense of the private economy. And when it comes to regulatory reform, maybe the pace slowed down a little bit. We had the pandemic to manage. We all understand that. But then at the end of the day, ambiguous rules and regulation, the unpredictable legislative environment, administrative approvals, and other issues continue to demand that China advance its regulatory reform more quickly. 1/3 of respondents faced negative consequences as a result of CII restrictions and the increasingly common talk about the need for autonomous and controllable technology. So maybe I will pause here to give you two sectors as practical example: ICT and banking. So first, ICT, network equipment providers and services are negatively affected, both directly through security review requirements that are vague and unclear, as well as through customers that want to integrate European solutions but wonder about the political calculus should something change in the coming years. For banking, foreign banks are pushed to integrate extensively with local digital systems and network equipment. This is possible, but doing so will take extensive amount of money, and smaller European banks are considering leaving if they are required to do so, as it isn't worth the highly limited market share that they can compete for.
Yeah, I think this this point that you make about CII, the critical information infrastructure requirements and restrictions, and then also the sort of vaguer idea of autonomous and controllable technologies. This is sort of a rapidly rising concern that I hear from a lot of our members, because everybody is undergoing digitalization. Everybody is incorporating some degree of network equipment into smart manufacturing, into data processing and storage, things like this. It already is a big problem, but I think if things don't actually get solved about it pretty soon, it's going to be one of those kind of top of the list priorities of the European Chamber. And I certainly hope that our members are acquainting themselves with these issues so that they're aware and they can respond in the best way possible. So moving on to sort of tech and innovation, we have some interesting data on technology transfers, of compelled technology transfers, and also on IPR protection and enforcement. And I'll note that I think it's important to kind of separate these issues a little bit, because I think a lot of people think of compelled technology transfer as an IPR issue. In reality, it's more of a market access issue, because compelled technology transfer basically only happens because of joint venture requirements to begin with. So
yeah, I agree, Jacob, actually. Compelled technology transfer is a question that we ask every year to our member. We want to understand if it's still happening. And actually, in this year, we had 16% of respondents, yet again, who reported that they felt compelled to transfer technology. And you are right, this is as a condition for market access. So the number is worrying because it's the same as last year. And actually, 40% of those were compelled to transfer tech in the last 12 months. Why I highlight this point? Not only because this is recent, but also because we were then in a post-foreign investment law environment. So, the foreign investment law was written for many reasons. One of these was to stop this compelled technology transfer, and we can see that it is still happening. On a separate note, and I agree with you that it is a different topic, but it still relates to innovation somehow, IPR protection and enforcement. There we see some progress, and 2021 is the first year that at least half of respondents found IPR enforcement to be adequate or excellent. So this is an important milestone. this is also a sign that there is a long way to go. We came from very far. And this is largely driven by China's own growing innovative capacity. So, in a way, I pay tribute to that. This is something that we see here on the market, and our respondents see the same. So 72% of them see Chinese firms as equally or more innovative than European ones.
Yeah, I think on the IPR protection and enforcement front, another interesting point of data from the survey was whether or not the respondents had IPR infringement issues in the last year. And we actually saw an increase in the last couple of years of the number of infringement cases. It's still lower than it was historically, but I think as a testament to kind of the improvements of the IPR protection and enforcement system, companies still noted those improvements last year, even though infringements were becoming more common. And it's important, I think, to remember the issue is not infringement. Infringement happens in Europe. Infringement happens in Canada. IP infringement happens everywhere. It's whether or not there's a system to seek, recompense and justice. The fact that, again, the number of infringements were increasing, but so was the satisfaction in the enforcement mechanism, I think says a lot about China's legitimate desire to improve their IPR protection. All right, and moving on kind of to our last big section, we have a couple of other new areas that we looked into this year for the very first time. So first, we have decarbonization, and this kind of fits in with President Xi's commitment that China will reach carbon neutrality by 2060. And then we also have some questions about the recently recruited RCEP, the big new trade deal covering East and Southeast Asia all the way to Australia and New Zealand. So Charlotte, can you start us off with decarbonization, especially from Engie?
Yeah,
it seems very suitable.
That's a pleasure indeed. So decarbonization is indeed in everybody's mind, and actually the commitment taken by China is really a great commitment to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. It completes the commitment that was taken to peak carbon emission by 2030. So actually this pace is very ambitious. In Europe, we peaked carbon emission in the 90s, depending on whether it considers EU or Europe as a continent. So there is a lot going on that. And so we had specific question on decarbonization, and 55% of members reported that they were either already carbon neutral, which is very positive, or will be by 2030. So what is important to highlight there, besides the figure, is that the fact that European companies are really a strength for China to push carbon neutrality, and we are used to technologies to support that, so that's really something that we can contribute in China. A mere 14%, 1/4, don't expect to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, but it is still 10 years earlier than China's own ambition of reaching the same goal. So again, I would really encourage, and I'm not sure they would listen to the podcast, but Chinese authorities to leverage on European business to push carbon neutrality. We are all working in the same direction, and that's a very, that's something that strives enthusiasm. So we should really work together on that. RCEP is a bit different, and actually came a bit as a surprise if we compare to the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that was negotiated for quite a long time between the EU and China. But it's relatively new, and 74% of respondents say they either don't expect any significant impact or that it's too early to tell. The fact that there is no significant impact can come also from the fact that it's about Asia as a whole market. But anyway, it was really close to the announcement where we made the survey. And of the remaining 26%, all but 3% anticipate a positive impact. So rather positive or neutral, I would say.
Okay, well, that's the end of our sort of discussion about the key findings of the Business Confidence Survey. However, listeners who want to read the report themselves and dig into more of the detail, they can go to the European Chamber website at europeanchamber.com.cn. Just go to the Publications tab at the top of the page, and you'll be able to download the PDF at no charge. We want to say thanks again to our partner, Roland Berger, for helping us put together this cornerstone of our work at the Chamber. It's really essential to a lot of the things we do, and it's very valuable for the Chinese government, for our members, for European governments, and beyond. And lastly, Charlotte, I want to thank you for joining us on the podcast today. It's been a delight to get to dig into the BCS with you and sort of see how things panned out in this particularly unique year that we had in 2020.
Thank you, Jacob.
Once again, a big thanks to Charlotte Rule for joining me here in the studio today, and also thanks to our partners at Roland Berger. As always, I'd like to thank my colleagues Zhang Yicher and Gao Rui, without whom this wouldn't be possible. They do all the back-end work. Unfortunately, for myself and for Zhang Yicher, this will be our last episode of China Dispatches, as we're both leaving the chamber to pursue new opportunities. As a result, the next episode of China Dispatches may be delayed for a while. But the team at the European Chamber hopes to be back with you all soon and to help bring you more of the on-the-ground insights that we're best able to provide. It's been a pleasure, everybody. Thank you.